So let's get stuck in to building our first web application with Razor Pages in ASP.NET Core. So we're using this tutorial on Microsoft.com. We should have our prerequisites set up already, so we should have Visual Studio, the latest version of that, installed already. Note that if you are using a different platform, so if you're using Mac or if you wanted to use Visual Studio Code, there are alternative instructions throughout this tutorial, which is particularly useful and a good feature of most of Microsoft's tutorials. But we won't be drilling into that too much. We're going to stick to the Windows way of doing things for now to keep things simple. So there are some points here about you can actually download the final app and kind of run it if you wanted to, but we're going to skip that. We are going to go from scratch and we're going to build out our first web application. So if we open up Visual Studio, we should get our welcome page, and we're going to create a new project. And when the next screen loads, so we have some options that we can choose from. So there are different types of project that we can choose within ASP.NET. So we are going to choose ASP.NET Core Web App. There are other options such as .NET Core Web API. So if we wanted to build a RESTful API that a front-end JavaScript application was going to talk to, we could build out our API. But we are going to create what's known as a round-trip application, or like a full-stack web application, where the front-end code and the back-end code is in the same project. Not saying that that's the best approach, that is just one approach. And so we're going to choose ASP.NET Core Web App, and we're going to start building out our Razor Pages project. So if we select that and hit Next, we can then give it a name. So I'm going to call it John's Test Project, and I'm going to store it in my local home folder. We can leave the solution name set to be the same, and we'll hit Next. I want to go through this tutorial using .NET 6, which has long-term support, as we mentioned in an earlier video. Authentication type. So this means that we can implement login and registration functionality out of the box, which is pretty cool. So that's another feature and benefit of .NET Core, that it comes with this ready-made functionality. And I'm going to enable this just so we can see it. And I'm going to go for individual accounts, which essentially will give us registration and login functionality where users can sign up and log in just using the standard kind of email and password authentication. So we'll enable that. We'll leave it configured for HTTPS, which is fine. If we encounter any issues with that later on, we'll look at snagging that. But let's go create. So once the new project has been set up, we should see a window within Visual Studio that opens looking a little bit like this. We'll likely get a welcome overview screen in the middle, and we have our Solution Explorer over on the right hand side, which essentially has our project files, and we can see that the solution is called John's Test Project, and the project within it is also called John's Test Project. There are some folders within there. Because this is a Razor Pages project, we have a Pages folder, and we can see some default content within that, an index page, a privacy page, and some shared partial pages as well. And the first thing that would be good to do to make sure everything's set up and working okay is to actually run the project and run it in our browser to check our Visual Studio setup is okay and we're not getting any issues. So let's do that now. To do that, we will hit the play button or run button up at the top of Visual Studio, and we'll go through that now. So this will trigger a build of the basic application. We can start seeing some diagnostic settings or analysis appearing over here on the right hand side. this kind of gives us an insight into how the application is running. You'll probably see a terminal window appear as well, which shows what's going on underneath the hood, as it were. So this is starting the application, and then in the browser we can see the web application is now running on our local host. Now what we didn't see here was potentially you might get a couple of alerts that ask you to accept the SSL certificate for localhost. So when you get those, you can check yes on those, and we can see here that if you have full control over your local machine, you shouldn't have any issues. It should install that local certificate, and it will show as secure when you're running the application on your local host. So if we click around the web application, we can see here's our privacy policy page, which we saw in Visual Studio in our Solution Explorer. We can also check out our registration and login functionality that we enabled by default. So here we have our registration page, which has some default styling. We've also got our login screen here. Now, of course, we can't log in because there aren't any details in the database. So if I was to register, let's test this out. So I'm going to enter a dummy email and dummy password. Okay, so we've got some strict password rules enforced there. Which is generally a good thing, although that's something that we can configure in our web application when we get into the details. So I need to add a password that has some special characters. So let's try that again. So what it's doing now is trying to register this new user into the database, which doesn't actually exist yet. So the reason it's taking a little bit of time is it's trying to create that database behind the scenes on this first run. Okay, so the first time we run this, we actually get a database failure. And this might look a little bit scary if we haven't seen it before, but this is actually a good thing, because what it's telling us is that it can't open a database, and that kind of makes sense because we haven't created it yet, but it's suggesting a solution. It's saying there are migrations that have not been applied to the following database. So there's actually a database migration which hasn't been run, and we've got a shortcut here, a button that we can click to actually run it. Now, if you're not familiar with database migrations are essentially a way of storing the structure of a database within a file in our code base. So it's a way of implementing changes to our database structure, but within our versioned code. Database migrations are essential for properly versioning the state of our application going forward. If you think about it, when we need to make a change to our database structure, if we just made that change directly on the database, how would our application know that that had changed? And how would even other developers know that that change had been made unless we document that somewhere centrally? And in Visual Studio, .NET Core, in full stack web applications, database migrations are the way to go. And this isn't specific to .NET Core. It applies to many other languages and many other frameworks, completely non-Microsoft. It's a common approach to essentially versioning our database structure. And we'll have a look at the examples of database migrations later in this tutorial series. This first migration that we haven't created, but it's already in our project, is related to ASP.NET Identity, which is the functionality that gives us registration and login features. So there is a database migration file that contains the definitions for a users table, for example, and many other associated tables that come with the ASP.NET Identity functionality. We'll come back to that. If you don't fully understand it, don't worry, but we'll run this migration and then see what happens. So now we've run it, we get a little alert updated that says try refreshing the page. So this is telling us it's run it in the background, but now we need to rerun the page load, and we'll see this time if it works. So let's go refresh. We'll do confirm form resubmission. So we want to send our same registration details again. And hopefully this time they'll register to the database. Okay, so success of a sort. We have our register confirmation page here. And there's a note here about that this app does not currently have a real email sender registered to configure email verification. So this would be a common feature in that when we have new users register to our web application, we would want their email address to be confirmed, because this would reduce the amount of spam or accounts that are trying to register that aren't legitimate. So as a shortcut, because we don't have email sending set up, we can just click this link here, which just manually confirms our account, which is fine for local development. So if I click on that, that will then confirm my account and we get a confirmation. This would be the confirmation screen that we would get if we got a confirmation email and clicked on the link in the email, but we're getting it here by a manual approach. So that's all good. Now, if I try logging in with the details that I set, let's see if that works. So we're john@test.com. See if I can remember my password. We'll go log in. I don't want to remember it. And there we go. It has logged me in because it says hello and then puts my email address. And if I click on that link at the top, it will take us to our account section. And we get again confirmation that our email is confirmed. But we have a bit of a profile here. We could add our phone number. We've got our email section. Password, where we can change our password. We have to enter current and then new and confirm it. We can also enable two-factor authentication. And then personal data, which is related to GDPR, which is very useful. We can download all our data as a user, or we can delete our account. So all this functionality comes out of the box just by enabling authentication when we created a new project. So we get a lot of value from using a framework like .NET Core. And for now, we don't need to edit any of this. We can extend identity. We can add more fields to our profile, for example, and that will potentially be something we'll look at later. But for the time being, what we've ascertained so far is that the web application works, it runs, it has been able to create a local database, which we'll verify shortly in Visual Studio itself. It's stored a new user registration and we've been able to log in with that user.